the United States is now openly threatening new tariffs on its closest European allies, not over trade disputes, not over defense spending, but over Greenland. This isn't just another tough negotiating tactic. And it's not just about money. Because while the headlines focus on tariffs, protests, and diplomatic backlash, what's happening underneath reveals something much bigger: a fundamental shift in how power, security, and alliances are being discussed in the Arctic. And once you see how these pieces connect, the tariffs, the protests, the military exercises, and the political shift inside Washington, this story starts to look far less isolated and far more consequential. According to publicly available statements, President Donald Trump announced that the United States would impose a 10% tariff on goods from several European countries, including Denmark, Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, beginning February 1st. He added that those tariffs would increase to 25% by June 1st, unless a deal is reached involving Greenland. This wasn't framed as a temporary trade disagreement. In Trump's own words, the issue was presented as one of global security and even world peace. That framing matters, because when a dispute moves from economics into the language of security, the stakes change immediately. And Europe understood that right away. Why Greenland keeps coming up: Greenland is an autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark, with its own parliament and the right to self-determination. It is sparsely populated, geographically massive, and positioned between North America and the Arctic. Publicly available analyses have long pointed to Greenland's importance for early warning systems, satellite tracking, and Arctic navigation routes. But what's different now is how directly that importance is being tied to pressure on allies. Trump has argued, repeatedly, that Denmark's defenses are insufficient and that the presence of small numbers of European military personnel on the island represents, in his words, a dangerous situation for global security. Those comments triggered immediate diplomatic concern. Not because NATO exercises are unusual, they're not, but because of timing, tone, and symbolism. Europe responds, carefully but visibly. Within days, several NATO countries deployed small military contingents to Greenland for joint exercises with Denmark. Officially, these were routine and cooperative. Unofficially, according to diplomatic observers, they sent a clear signal: Greenland is not isolated, and Denmark is not standing alone. At the same time, European leaders began coordinating political responses. The European Council President announced plans for a coordinated response, emphasizing respect for international law and territorial integrity. But the most visible reaction didn't come from government buildings. It came from the streets. In Denmark, thousands of people demonstrated in Copenhagen, Aarhus, Aalborg, and Odense. In Greenland's capital, Nuuk, an estimated 5,000 people gathered, nearly 10% of the island's total population. That number alone matters, because it turns this from an abstract geopolitical discussion into something deeply personal for the people who actually live there. Protesters carried banners reading, "Hands off Greenland. Greenland is not for sale," and "We shape our future." Some spoke directly to international media, emphasizing that Greenland's future should be decided by Greenlanders, not negotiated between foreign capitals. Importantly, these demonstrations were organized peacefully, in coordination with NGOs and Greenlandic organizations, and timed to coincide with a visit from U.S. district lawmakers. That timing was not accidental. While the president escalated rhetoric publicly, a bipartisan delegation from the U.S. Congress arrived in Copenhagen. Their message was notably different. Democratic Senator Chris Coons, who led the delegation, described the administration's tempo of statements as unhelpful. He also emphasized respect for Greenland's indigenous population, their culture, and their right to self-determination. The delegation highlighted long-standing military cooperation between Denmark and the United States, even visiting a cemetery honoring Danish soldiers who fought alongside American troops in past conflicts. That contrast between executive rhetoric and congressional diplomacy did not go unnoticed. And it raised a bigger question. Is this really about Greenland or something else? To understand why this matters, you have to zoom out. Because Greenland is not the only place where forceful language has recently entered the conversation. According to polling from Marist College, a majority of Republicans now express support for hypothetical military action in several regions, including Venezuela, Iran, Mexico, Cuba, and Greenland. Support varies by location, and military action is not precisely defined in the poll. An important caveat, but the overall trend is difficult to ignore. Compared to previous years, fewer Republicans now say the U.S. should take a less active role in global affairs. Public opinion is shifting, and history shows that when rhetoric shifts first, policy often follows. What makes this moment particularly sensitive is that resistance isn't just coming from Europe or Democrats. Several Republican lawmakers have publicly criticized the approach. Representative Don Bacon called the threats toward NATO allies shameful, noting that existing alliance structures already give the U.S. significant strategic access in the Arctic. Polling also suggests that while Republicans may support a stronger global posture overall, the idea of acquiring Greenland by force remains unpopular, even within Trump's own party. In other words, the political ground here is far from solid, and that uncertainty is exactly what keeps allies on edge. Tariffs, in this context, aren't just about trade balances. They function as leverage. European leaders have warned that these measures would hurt exporters, disrupt supply chains, and strain already fragile economic recovery. UK political figures, including Nigel Farage, have publicly acknowledged that such tariffs would damage British interests, even as they maintain strong ties with Washington. When economic pressure is applied between allies, trust becomes collateral damage. And once trust erodes, rebuilding it takes far longer than imposing a tariff. Right now, nothing irreversible has happened. Tariffs have been announced, not fully implemented. Statements have been made, not formal agreements reached. Exercises have taken place, but no permanent changes declared. But the direction of travel is clear. Greenland has become a symbol, not just of Arctic security, but of how power is asserted in a changing world. And the most important part of this story may not be what happens next week, but how this moment reshapes alliances in the years ahead. The Arctic is no longer a background issue. For decades, the Arctic sat quietly in the background of global politics. It was discussed in academic papers, climate reports, and long-term security assessments, rarely in breaking headlines, and almost never in connection with tariffs between allies. That has changed. Melting ice has opened new shipping routes. Advances in missile detection and satellite technology have increased the region's strategic value, and competition between major powers has turned geography into leverage. Greenland sits at the center of all three. According to publicly available defense assessments, the island's location makes it uniquely important for early warning systems and monitoring activity across the North Atlantic and Arctic corridors. That reality isn't disputed, even by European governments. What is disputed is how that reality should be handled. Historically, Arctic security has been framed as a cooperative effort. the United States already maintains a long-standing military presence in Greenland through agreements with Denmark. NATO coordination in the region has existed for years. Joint exercises are routine, which is why the current approach stands out. Instead of expanding cooperation through existing frameworks, pressure is being applied externally through trade policy, public ultimatums, and rhetorical escalation. That's a meaningful shift, because when security goals are pursued through economic coercion rather than alliance consensus, it changes how allies calculate risk. And those calculations don't stop at Greenland. Why? Denmark matters more than it looks on paper. Denmark is a small country. In practice, it sits at the center of this dispute. Greenland governs its internal affairs and has its own parliament, but defense and foreign policy remain tied to Copenhagen. Any change in Greenland's status would have implications not just for Denmark, but for NATO and EU unity. That's why European leaders reacted so quickly. Not because Greenland might change hands tomorrow, but because the process being suggested bypasses norms that alliances rely on. As one Danish political leader put it, Europe cannot give in to bully methods. That language is strong, but it reflects a growing concern. If this approach works once, it sets a precedent. Inside Greenland, opinion polls consistently show strong opposition to joining the United States. That's a critical point. This is not a territory without a voice. The protests in Nuuk weren't symbolic gestures. They represented a significant portion of the population, gathered peacefully to assert agency over their future. In Denmark, public support for Greenland's right to self-determination is similarly strong. And across Europe, the issue has become less about Trump as an individual and more about how far economic pressure can go before alliances fracture. To fully understand why this moment feels different, you have to look at domestic U.S. politics. For years, Donald Trump was associated with a more restrained, non-interventionist foreign policy, at least rhetorically. But polling now suggests that phase is over. Surveys from multiple organizations indicate growing Republican support for the use of military power abroad, even in scenarios involving close neighbors or allied regions. Importantly, this doesn't mean unconditional support. In most cases, respondents express qualified approval, not strong endorsement. And when proposals become specific, such as using force to acquire Greenland, support drops sharply. That tells us something important. The base may be more open to assertive action, but there are still red lines, and leaders know that. One reason this situation feels unstable is that many terms remain undefined. Military action can mean anything from expanded basing to logistical support. Security threats are referenced broadly, without detailed public evidence. Deals are mentioned without clear frameworks. That ambiguity creates space for speculation and anxiety. Markets react, diplomats scramble, allies prepare contingency plans. Even if no drastic action is taken, the uncertainty itself becomes destabilizing. NATO has been careful in its public messaging. European countries have emphasized that Arctic security should remain a joint responsibility, not a unilateral one. By deploying small, symbolic contingents to Greenland, they signaled unity without provocation. It's a delicate balance. Too little response could appear as weakness. Too much could escalate tensions unnecessarily. So far, the alliance is walking that line cautiously. But that balance depends on predictability. And predictability is exactly what's in short supply right now. Tariffs have traditionally been tools of economic negotiation. Here, they're being used differently. By tying trade penalties directly to territorial and security outcomes, the administration is blending economic and geopolitical leverage in ways that make allies uncomfortable. European officials have warned that these measures would hurt both sides, disrupting supply chains, raising costs, and slowing growth. But beyond economics, there's a deeper concern: trust. Alliances are built on the assumption that disagreements will be resolved internally, not through public pressure campaigns. Once that assumption erodes, everything becomes transactional. Even if tariffs are delayed, even if rhetoric softens, even if no deal is reached, the signal has already been sent. Greenland is now firmly on the geopolitical map, not as a distant territory, but as a pressure point. And the way this dispute is handled will influence how future disagreements unfold, not just in the Arctic, but across other strategic regions. The question is no longer whether Greenland matters. It's whether alliances can adapt to a world where economic tools, security language, and public pressure are increasingly intertwined. One of the quiet themes running through this entire situation is scale. Greenland is geographically vast, but demographically small. Its population is smaller than many medium-sized cities, yet its strategic relevance places it in conversations normally reserved for major powers. That imbalance matters because when global competition intensifies, places like Greenland often become symbols, not because of what they are, but because of what they represent: access, position, leverage. History shows that when strategic value rises faster than political safeguards, tension follows. And that's why Greenland's leaders have been so consistent in their messaging. Any future decisions must come from the people who live there. Public statements don't exist in a vacuum. When leaders use language about security, survival, or global stakes, it changes how institutions respond, even if policies remain unchanged. Financial markets adjust expectations. Military planners review contingencies. Allies reassess reliability. This doesn't mean conflict is inevitable. But it does mean that words themselves become strategic signals. And in this case, those signals have been mixed. Another underreported element is the internal U.S. dynamic. While the president has framed Greenland as a non-negotiable security issue, members of Congress, from both parties, have taken a more measured approach. The bipartisan delegation to Denmark wasn't just symbolic diplomacy. It was a reminder that U.S. foreign policy is not monolithic. Legislative pressure, public opinion, and alliance commitments still matter. That internal friction can slow down dramatic shifts, but it can also create uncertainty for allies trying to interpret Washington's true direction. Perhaps the most important concern in Europe isn't Greenland itself. It's precedent. If economic penalties can be used to push territorial outcomes between allies, what happens the next time strategic interests collide? That's why European leaders have emphasized international law, self-determination, and collective security frameworks. They're not just responding to one dispute, they're defending the rules that prevent dozens of future ones. It's important to be precise here. Despite heated rhetoric, there is no indication of imminent military action in Greenland. Polling shows that even within the Republican Party, support drops sharply when proposals become concrete or involve force against allies. European resistance, legal constraints, and institutional checks all make extreme outcomes unlikely. But unlikely doesn't mean irrelevant, because the conversation itself has shifted, and once certain ideas enter mainstream debate, they don't simply disappear. Zooming out, This story fits into a broader global pattern. Major powers are reassessing supply chains, energy routes, defense perimeters, and spheres of influence. The Arctic, once peripheral, now intersects all of them. Greenland happens to sit at that intersection. And how this situation resolves will send signals far beyond Northern Europe. What's happening around Greenland isn't just a dispute over tariffs or territory. It's a live test of how modern alliances handle pressure, economic, political, and strategic, in a rapidly changing world. The outcome won't be measured by who wins a deal, but by whether cooperation can survive moments of intense leverage. And the next chapter of this story may not begin in Greenland at all. It may emerge from how other regions, watching closely, decide to respond when strategic value meets political power. In the next video, we'll break down how the Arctic is becoming the next major theater of global competition, and why decisions made now could shape international stability for decades.